ever wondered what will it take for the world to realize that it does need healing? That it does, in fact, need the presence of one who cares so deeply that he is willing to give his life to make it a better place for all of God's people? What will it take for the world to eventually understand that it was created to be a place filled with all the good gifts of God for everyone and for every creature under heaven? This was God's purpose at the very beginning. And since that time, God has continued to work for restoring the world to its original purpose and its original condition. I ask the question, not what will it take for the world to understand this, but what will it take for us? Are we waiting for some great momentary incident in our lives that will confirm everything that God has been at work doing from the very beginning? Do we wait saying, it hasn't happened for me yet, or I haven't had all of this stuff confirmed in my life? When is God going to say what I need to hear and somehow be that presence for me in my life, in my family, in my community? I don't know if you just followed the news recently about the young mother who gave birth to her baby, and at the time of the birth was declared dead. And then shortly after the doctors made that declaration, she had a heartbeat that suddenly started, and she came alive again. And one of the things that she said to the doctors and to those who were so concerned because she had died was that as she was making this journey from this world to the next, she was met by a presence that said, it isn't your time yet. You have to go back. I am always interested in folk who have this kind of experience to see, in fact, how their lives unfold after that kind of an experience. Is it a transforming, a powerful moment that somehow moves life in a whole new direction, changes the way one thinks, changes the way one lives each and every day, impacts and affects the very relationships of their lives as a mother, a wife, a member of the community? What kind of an effect does this have on this person's life or others who have had such a moment in their own journeys? And then I wonder, are we waiting for that moment for ourselves? Are we putting everything on hold until somehow we will know without a shadow of a doubt that this is a part of God's plan for not only the world but for our individual lives? What will it take for persons to come to grips with this kind of reality? That God has always, from the very beginning, wanted nothing but the best for us and for the world around us. And in every generation, God has been seeking to find a way to break into the pain and the brokenness, to break into the hostilities of the world in such a way that a healing bridge can be realized by folk who seem to be so fractured and so separated from each other and from themselves as well. For the great sadness of our world is that it's not only when we are not in right relationship with God that we seem to become a part of that which rends the fabric of creation, but it also rends our own personal fabric as well. Why is it that Jesus said that we should love our neighbor after we love God, and we should love ourselves? God's work is that in all of those aspects of creation, there should be this sense of hope and purpose, and that's what it takes to make us stand firm in the faith. We can't afford to give in to the pressures of the world around us, to conform to the way of the world. We're called out of the world. Jesus lived in the world but was not of the world. His disciples lived in the world but were not of the world, even though they ate and did all the things we do every day. The focus of their existence was to be a part of this healing and transforming work that God had started in Jesus Christ. God has never given up. But the question is, what will it take? What will it take for the world to understand what God's purpose and God's activity really means for this troubled and fractured world? And what does it take for each and every one of us? It's not likely that we're going to have the experience this young mother had. And so what's left for us? Shall we hold in abeyance our faith, our trust, our hope in Jesus Christ until such a moment comes to us? Or shall we trust that in Jesus, God was sending a message to the world that is so powerful and so dynamic and with such great purpose that we need to be embraced by it? Even in our most dark moments, our most uncertain times, the word that God sent into the world in Jesus Christ is in fact our hope. So we begin this journey in the Advent season. We begin it by looking to the hope that God would want to put in every human heart, in every generation, in every community, in every nation across the face of this globe. Rather than living with despair and brokenness and uncertainty, God would like to find a way to bring this message to this troubled world, knowing that if we can simply be embraced by it, it will somehow be a transforming presence and power. And so we see the big picture. We know the world is in trouble. But in Isaiah's time, it was in trouble as well. Why did Isaiah write these words to his own people, the prophet, who said, "You are turning away from the very God who gave you the gift of life, who sustains you and keeps you and blesses you all the days of your life? Why are you turning away? And why are you giving in to the iniquities of the world around you?" But then he ends that with that simple word of hope. You are God's people. That was Isaiah's way of saying, God is not going to give up on us. God is not a quitter. God is not someone who's going to throw up God's hands and say, I've had enough. Because God believes in the power of love to transform human existence and to transform the very world itself. God believes that. And from the very beginning, God has been acting to help us be embraced by that in such a way that our lives, our brokenness, is healed. And we feel new and ready again to go into the world and proclaim the good news. The sad thing is that sometimes we have such difficulty believing that God really loves us enough to bring that healing. Of course, Isaiah's concern was for the nation. But the words of the Apostle Paul and the words of Jesus were words that were trying to convey to us that we have to have a sense of readiness, anticipation, expectation, not giving into despair or hopelessness or uncertainty, but actually trusting and believing that God is still at work. And in the fullness of God's time, it will come to pass. You know, the writer of Ecclesiastes said there's a season for everything under heaven. And I think basically he knew that what Jesus was saying in the Gospel of Mark and what Paul was proclaiming to those young churches out there around Asia Minor was that at some point, God will proclaim the victory of love over hate, of hope over despair, in such a way that the world can't miss it. It'll happen. It will happen. But in the meantime, it needs to happen in us. And it needs to be conveyed in us and through us to the world. So we begin the journey of Advent. We light a candle of hope in anticipation, in expectation, in the sure knowledge that God continues to be at work in this world and in us. And so Christ becomes the hope of our individual lives, and Christ becomes the hope of the world. Can you imagine how the world would rejoice in healing if they would simply trust what God has said to the world in Jesus Christ. What a glorious moment that would be. But the reality is, what a glorious moment that will be. And that's why these words in Mark were spoken. Because in the fullness of God's time, it will happen. And that's the promise that we see in Jesus Christ. So as we move together through this holy season, let's not give in to those forces around us that would rob us of the sure knowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. And let us rejoice and be glad in that. And let us share the hope that Christ brings into the world with those around us, with our family, our friends, our community. For we are a hope-filled people. And our hope will never be disappointed. Because that promise was made to us in Jesus Christ.